some more people will be arriving. I'm Jude Kelly. I'm the founder of the WOW Women of the World Foundation, and I'll be moderating this morning's session. It's quite a complex session with quite a number of speakers. I'll introduce you to them in a minute. But we're going to get going straight away with Laura Bates, because those of you who know Laura Bates from her incredible work, Everyday Sexism, which is now in so many countries around the world, and her follow-up work on all kinds of initiatives and ideas around the root and branch of patriarchy and its impact on the world and on the kind of relationship of individuals to themselves as well as society. Her work has been so groundbreaking. She's going to break some more ground in other places this morning, so she's got to leave. So we're eager to hear her kind of sense of the state of play at the moment, particularly around boys, who of course grow into men. So can I introduce Laura Bates? Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this morning for the launch of this really vital report from the Global Boyhood Initiative. It's never been a more important time to address the many challenges impacting boys and young men. And for far too long, I think, social and political discourse and anti-feminist backlash have positioned the needs of boys and men in direct opposition to progress for women and girls. But as this report so clearly shows, in reality, the opposite is true. And of course, this has long been very clear to those working on the front line with young people. I run the Everyday Sexism project, which collects people's experiences of all forms of gender inequality with the aim of raising awareness and of finding solutions to the problem. And I'm also very proud to be a board member of Equimundo, which of course has been a major part of this report and is a world-leading organisation engaging men and boys globally in the pursuit of social justice, healthy masculinities and gender equity. There are some who would consider these two roles to be incongruous, but I've seen firsthand in my work how closely the goals of gender equity and healthy masculinities are entwined. It was very early on in the days of the Everyday Sexism project that we started to get messages from children. And I always remember one of the earliest messages we got from an 8-year-old girl saying that she'd been kicked off the football pitch at break time at school and told that football wasn't for girls. And a 15-year-old boy who wanted to continue with the dance classes that he loved but was being bullied relentlessly by his classmates. In almost the same week in those early days of the project, we received a story from a man who had asked for extended parental leave from work to spend with his new baby daughter, and had not only had his request denied, but had been really ridiculed in the workplace for having asked, because surely, of course, that was his female partner's job. And in the same week, received a project entry from a woman with absolutely no intention of having any children, who was told that she wouldn't be considered for a promotion because they saw her as a maternity risk. So it has for so long been so clear that it is the same outdated gender stereotypes that are holding all of us back. I've also seen firsthand the enormous damage that gender stereotypes and the normalisation of male violence, as highlighted so clearly in this report, causes both to girls and boys. I will never forget the visit to a school where they'd had a rape case involving a 14-year-old boy, and a teacher told me that she'd asked him, "Why didn't you stop when she was crying?" And that he had looked at her quite confused and said, "Because it's normal for girls to cry during sex," because that's what he'd seen online. Or the project entry from the 18-year-old young woman who had had sex with her university boyfriend for the first time, only to be shocked when, with no warning, he started trying to choke and throttle her. She managed to panic and push him away, and he broke down in tears, sobbing and saying, "I'm so sorry. I just thought that would be what you would expect," because that was what he'd seen online. That was the role that society had carved out for him. But I've also seen reasons to be hugely hopeful in my work with young people. From the 3 young men, the boys who waited until the end of my talk at a school before approaching me nervously, kind of shuffling and nudging each other to say, "We wanted to start a feminist society and we were just wondering," and then kind of paused and nudged each other, and one of them went, are we allowed? That sense of the number of young men I see in my work who are so aware of these inconsistencies, these inequalities, and the devastating impact that they're having, and so keen to be part of the solution rather than the problem. And I've also seen firsthand the impact when open, constructive conversations happen with young people of all genders. I visited one school which was an all-girls school but often held events linked up with the local boys' school, and my talk to them about gender stereotypes and sexual consent was one such joint event. But in the morning before I arrived, the girls had seen on social media that a number of the boys had been kind of spreading myths and misinformation about feminism, complaining about having to go and listen to some bitch come and tell them why she hated men and so on, and really kind of determining to be a disruptive force during the talk as a group. Instead of deciding to report this to a teacher, the girls asked to leave their last lesson before the talk a few minutes early and headed to the auditorium, arriving before the boys. They then spaced themselves out so that they were sitting in every other seat throughout the entire auditorium, so that when the boys arrived, every one of them was forced to sit between two girls. What this did was create an openness and a dialogue. It took away that sense of a kind of dissenting block. It took away that nervous, knee-jerk, defensive reaction. And of course, we ended up having an incredibly constructive and positive conversation. Those conversations are possible when we are able to reach beyond the misinformation and the sense of a battle of the sexes and a gender war that is so often created in these conversations by the mainstream and the online media. So I'm so grateful to Equimundo and the Global Boyhood Initiative for supporting those conversations and for this vital report, which equips us with the insights that we need to move forward, not as part of a gender war or a battle of the sexes, not as men against women, but as people of all genders against forms of prejudice that are harming and suffocating us all. And I'll now hand you back to Jude Kelly, your brilliant moderator. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, we're all here presumably because we've either got a professional interest in the subject, but more, we've all got a personal interest in the subject because we live with each other, we love each other, we raise others like us, and we belong to generations of people who've gone before us. And it is sort of baffling and humiliating as a woman to still feel as if we're not equal all over the world. That's sort of a strangely humiliating feeling at times. And obviously there are other people who have different experiences of inequality than I do. And I think that, you know, it baffles all of us, how these structures of power remain in place to such an extent and they go so deep inside that an experience I had on Saturday when I took my two grandchildren, my 4-year-old granddaughter and my 3-year-old grandson to see Lyle the crocodile, yeah. And at the end of it, when the music came up, Judy went, oh, you know, let's go and dance at the front. And straight away, Reese said, boys don't dance. And then raced off to dance. But just that coming out of his mouth, and I should say he has 2 mums. So how is it that, you know, even at 3, a little boy will go, that's not what I do. It's very, very disturbing. And so we have so much to do to unlock, and it's not as simple as, well, if we do this program or that program, or we say these things enough, it will all kind of sort itself out. But as Laura says, we haven't given attention, we haven't given loving, specific attention to the needs of boys to help kind of start unraveling some of these hard known kind of ideas that have been passed down that you can see in images and they hear through the ether almost. It's almost like they're swimming through the water of it without even noticing it. And this project and now this report does give a set of tools and thoughts and help in thinking how we can start addressing this in detail. I started a project along with WOW called BAM, Being a Man, a few years ago, a festival that looked at the needs of boys and men, not from a point of view of how can we turn them all into feminists, but actually, you know, what is the sort of specific feeling in terms of an identity? What is masculinity? I mean, who knows? But at any rate, starting from the idea of love as opposed to opposition or correction. And I think that is, why we are all here, because we basically love humanity and we want humanity to make good choices. So I'm going to invite to the stage now Dr. Gary Barker, who has co-authored so many things, but he's in his lifetime so far. He's the CEO and the founder of Equimundo, and he's the co-founder and coordinator of the Global Boyhood Initiative. He's really been on this journey for years, looking at how he can make change happen. And I think that's quite an exhausting job, really, because I don't want to underestimate how hard it is to constantly be going up against oppositionality and to be looking at countries like Brazil, which is very much in his background, and now America, and of course, the increasing basket case, you could say the UK can become at times, and think, are we able to make enough progress when you have images of masculinity that are so toxic in leadership roles as we do at the moment? And he's going to be joined by Matteo, who's here, just arrived, and they're both going to give you a background on this whole report. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm very pleased to join the launch of the Global Boyhood Initiative today with you all. I am Mathieu Haro. I'm working for the Kering Foundation. Kering Foundation, which is the co-founder of the Global Boyhood Initiative, along with Equimundo. As you know, 1 in 3 women is or will be victim of violence during her lifetime. And the Kering Foundation has been working for 15 years now in combating violence against women, with a primary focus on supporting survivors, but also mobilizing other players and engaging the young generation. And so a couple of years ago, we started a conversation with Equimundo on the root causes of violence against women and how to engage young men to better prevent and to break the cycle of violence. And at the same time, we knew that stereotypes, norms, and violence are already deeply rooted at adolescence age, and somehow it's a bit too late to act on that. And so we start thinking with Equimundo about an initiative that could even target young boys. And that's how we co-founded the Global Boyhood Initiative. Other partners like Plan International and Gillette quickly joined the initiative, and today, after having launched a first chapter in the US 3 years ago, we are very happy to see the initiative expanding in other countries. So before I leave the floor to Gary, the idea through this initiative is really to guide boys on how to break stereotypes, on how to share emotion in a healthy way, how to connect with others, and how to stand up for equality and respect. And the idea is not to brainwash boys, but instead it's to avoid them being negatively restricted, negatively affected or restrictively defined by stereotypes and norms, and giving them the opportunity to develop their healthy and positive identities, and ultimately make them allies on gender equality promotion. So I leave the floor to Gary, and thank you very much.
I think there's a clicker here. Yeah. First off, thanks everyone for being here, and Jude, thank you for that introduction. Laura, I think, had to take off, but wanted to say thanks to her as well. Really thrilled to be here with our partners from Lifting Limits, from UCL, who've worked on this report that we'll hear a little bit later, colleagues from New Macho, who are partners on this as well, colleagues at Ladbury PR, who support us on this. This really is a partnership, and glad that you could make it, Matteo, coming in early this morning from Paris. I realize this could look a bit like a French-American invasion of the UK, but I promise it's not about that. We are we're thrilled, and we're partnering in the UK on this because there has been so much rich work, including Beyond Equality and others who have inspired us. And so this really is a dialogue of what can we do together around promoting healthy boyhood. I'll just use a few things there. As Matteo mentioned, this is a partnership between us and the Kering Foundation. I should mention that Selma Hayek, who is the board chair of the foundation, really was a big impetus for getting this going, of saying, why aren't you starting your conversations earlier? Equimundo's work over the years has mostly been with young men and young women and non-binary individuals, usually starting a few years later. But her instigation was, aren't you starting too late? And really did spur us to think about what would a conversation at earlier ages look like. Plan International, I know a couple of colleagues from Plan are here as well, part of this, who have done fantastic work, particularly about asking about girls for many years. And I think it is important to say this is not about decentering the work that is not yet done to ensure full and equitable, healthy lives for girls as well. This is a with, not an instead of. And really, this is what we're about, and I think Jude set it off with, this is about stepping into a conversation about boyhood, believing boys can be better, healthier human beings, really believing in their full potential, their full human potential in these conversations. A lot of our conversations with adult men and young men go in from a deficit perspective. There is a lot of harm to call out for lots of good reasons. But this is really about what is the calling in? What is the vision that we have from our sons starting at early ages of what healthy, connected boyhood and manhood humanity looks like? And so these are really our 4 North Stars there, that we can share emotions in healthy ways, we can accept and connect and love in appropriate and healthy ways, we can break free from these stereotypes, and that boys can in fact be allies for the full feminist equality that we believe in. We started off this work with research with parents in the US, and there's similar kinds of research being carried out in France at the moment, about to do similar research in Mexico as well. What we found out in the US is that a lot of parents are really worried about their sons. In fact, our research and others find that some parents are more worried about their sons than their daughters these days. I think it's better to say they're worried about their sons for different reasons. But the good news is they're worried about their sons. That does mean we can perhaps step into a conversation about what to do. Both on the political left and the political right, parents were worried. They often had different views of what to do. But it is good news that parents are worried about their sons because it allows us to start a conversation. What is it that you're worried about? How can we support you? How can you pay greater attention to what's happening with your sons? So the why boyhood question, I've answered a little bit of that, but just quickly, we've been doing research in more than 50 countries now with our International Men and Gender Equality Survey and our Man Box Survey, and it is disturbing to see how much forces on the right are pushing back on the gains we've made in the feminist space. There are a lot of young men going backwards on views around gender compared to their father's or grandfather's generation. But that's one piece of the story. At the same time, everywhere we look, 20 to 25% of young men actually are ready to break out of the man box altogether. There's a lot of fluidity, there's a lot of pushing back against harmful norms, together with a really organized effort in some countries, and I would say including in the UK, to reinstate some harmful views around masculinities. So, I think that leads to a lot of confusion for boys, for young men, for parents, for teachers. We step into this believing that a conversation around healthy masculinities and male allyship for gender equality is good to start even younger. And we'll hear some reflections from work happening in schools here in the UK as part of this. There's a lot of conversation around boys' educational challenges. Research out from the World Bank and UNESCO confirming that across 140 countries in the world, boys are faring worse than girls in school. Now, that's partly how we measure educational attainment and educational outcomes. And I think too often that conversation turns into, we're done with girls' education, now let's shift to boys. That is not what the conversation should be about. It needs to be looking at how gender plays out in schools in complex ways. And so our study that you'll hear a little bit later talks about that. But we are trying to look at this, again, not decentering the conversation around girls. It is saying, how do we also need to look at what's happening in schools for boys? So what is the initiative about? It's about research to action. You'll hear some of that we're launching in the UK today. It's about building online tools for parents, teachers, and others for how to have conversations around healthy masculinities with boys and with girls. It's about program implementation. We'll hear some examples from Lifting Limits that's leading that here in the UK, and then a list of the partner countries that this work is starting. We envision it as an exchange, listening, learning together. It's not a one answer, one size fits all, but really to reflect and do this together. A big space that we're trying to make more sense of is what's happening in the online spaces. Research we've done in the US, both looking at the masculinities content of what boys are watching on television and the games they're playing, is to be very disturbed in terms of the messages boys are seeing. The research also finding that boys are far more likely to spend more time online. A lot of our lives as young men are spent online, both in streaming and in gaming. What is happening there is mostly negative, but not only. And I think that's why we called that one study the double-edged sword of online gaming, because at the same time, boys are telling us that's where I can be my true self. I'm finding connections with others. It is my social space. Who are you to question it? So again, as we look at the complexity of online spaces, saying there's a lot of harm that's happening there, but it's not just a single response, and it's not just a single narrative about what boys are seeing, even when they're navigating, say, looking at Andrew Tate, for example. Even spaces like that, many boys are telling us, I can see some good stuff there, and I can also see some of the harm. So we're trying to look in complex ways at what boys are seeing online. We're using these studies to have conversations with video game makers and also with producers in Hollywood around how messaging and the complexity of masculinities can be presented when we think about this work. So I want to stop there. That was a really quick overview, and now hand it back to Jude.
Thanks, Gary. And incidentally, my phone is somewhere, and if it goes off, it'll be mine, just so as you know, because I haven't turned it off and I can't find it. We're now going to do a kind of whistle-stop through 4 different speakers, and then it'll be followed by a Q&A with you. So if you can be thinking about the things you want to raise, as well as things that come up as we go along. First, we're going to hear from Professor Jessica Ringrose and Sara Bragg, who are the lead authors of State of the Boys Report. Just to give you a quick bio, Jessica Ringrose is the person who is, she's obviously an expert in diversity and equality, and she's co-chair of the International Gender and Education Association, GAA, and co-director of the Centre for Sociology of Education and Equity. And Dr. Sara Bragg is a lecturer in sociology and programme lead for the MA Social Justice and Education at UCL. Then we're going to hear from Karen Gestepner, who's the Chief Executive and co-founder of Lifting Limits. And then we're going to hear from Ben Hurst, who's Head of Facilitation of Beyond Equality. He's the tallest in the room. That's just one of the things that we wanted to say. And in different ways, we've all been doing work around this area for years. You know, WOW, Women of the World, when I began it in 2011, it was really at a time, and you might remember this, you know, before Malala was shot, before the Boko Haram had kidnapped the first batch of Nigerian girls, before the Delhi rape, before, obviously, the Me Too movement. You know, so much has changed to make the conversation around feminism, if you like, much more livid and available all over the world. But really there hasn't been a series of call-to moments for the world around boys and men in the same way. And so, in a sense, all of those things that I've just raised that caused people to start saying, enough, it has to change all over the world, which is what I've seen since the WOW movement began. That has all been about, as Gary says, this kind of a deficit model of masculinity. And there haven't been, even though, you know, boys and men have had horrific issues themselves to deal with, it's never been placed inside a narrative that's allowed that to be something where people start defending the right of boys and men to have loving, reliable spaces in which masculinity can thrive differently. And I'm interested to know whether that can ever happen. You would think that Black Lives Matter maybe would have erased that, and to a certain extent it did for black men, but black boys, but you know, not in a clear enough way for everybody to gather around and support and help. So, we're not in a stage yet where the general society, through their kind of hearts as well as their minds, has gone, okay, this has got to be different now. But so this is really about, can we push society towards that space? So let's hand over first of all to Jessica and Sarah to lead on the report that they wrote, and then we'll go to Karen for her lifting limits, and then Ben. Thanks.
So do we have our slides? Oh, am I going back? Sorry. Great. Thank you very much. I'm Sara Bragg. We're here to launch 2 reports. We hope you'll read both. We'd like to acknowledge the contributions of our wonderful doctoral researchers, Sid and Idil, our co-authors, Equimundo, and all our expert informants. Bear in mind that this is a review of scholarship. It aims to contribute to a discussion rather than capturing all facets of boyhoods in the UK today. Professor Ringrose and I both work in the sociology of education and gender equity, and this informs the report. Psychology scholarship is probably better known, but it has a more individualistic approach. If we focus on individuals, we may tend to pathologise them, to think that the problems lie with them in their heads, their attitudes and behaviours, and that if we can just fix those, we'll bring about positive social change. Sociology studies the structures, cultures and practices that encourage, sustain and reproduce what individuals think, believe and do, and it argues that these need to be the focus of change. As such, sociology has a more encompassing view of gender as an organising principle in society. It helps us look at how society is saturated with gender norms and power dynamics, which are institutionalised, regulated, governed and policed, to which we're compelled to respond. There are risks to failing to inhabit them correctly. Gender is not something static that belongs to specific individual bodies. We can also think about how, for instance, spaces or school subjects such as science might be seen as masculinised, regardless of the gender of those occupying, studying and teaching them. Our approach is also post-developmental. Traditionally, children have been seen as moving through a series of predetermined universal biological stages towards heterosexual procreative adulthood, or as growing up and thus always in a state of becoming something else in the future. Current thinking identifies how childhood is both culturally and temporally specific and considers the agency of children themselves. And Catherine von Stockton's metaphor of growing sideways is a really nice way of challenging linear pathways, enabling us to attend to the complexity and possibility of children's lives, to see their rich being in the present, and to highlight the many non-normative ways children perform their gender and disrupt simplistic associations between sexed and gendered bodies.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica. So as we've been hearing, this is a very exciting time to be studying and doing research and looking at this issue of gender and masculinities in boyhood. We're in a moment where gender is particularly open due to the mainstreaming of the idea of gender fluid, non-binary, trans identities, and we say mainstreaming because it's essential to recognize none of this is new. Trans people have been documented for centuries, although they were unlikely to have defined themselves precisely in that way. And so we have all these amazing new vocabularies for understanding gender, and we can see that young people are redefining themselves through these new vocabularies as well, and we've been studying that for quite some time. So many of our key informants really looked at how welcome these developments were, and they talked about that. The report is based on a series of rich interviews with key informants to get the most up-to-date, state-of-the-art reflections on what's going on with this state of boyhood. On On the other hand, as we've already heard alluded to several times today, the key informants were concerned about what was going on around gender equity and how it was being derailed in some conversations and by some groups. So just as we're making strides around equity and inclusion, we often face backlash, we've already heard this morning, and we're certainly witnessing a resurgence in harmful versions of masculinity that are being repeatedly and explicitly spread by men's rights activists, and what I'm calling social media misogyny influencers. Jordan Peterson maybe for the old guys, and Andrew Tate on TikTok for the young ones. And so these arguments are often explicitly anti-feminist. They're portraying men, in particular white straight men, as losing out to feminism and other social justice movements, and positioning men as victims. So we're in this very weird, dangerous moment also where even people that seemingly take up the position of feminist are defining themselves as trans-exclusionary, and they're sort of positioning themselves against human rights. So we're in a very strange moment where we have to really re-articulate, and I really appreciate Gary, saying this is what we stand for, actually. This is what allyship looks like. No, we don't go against human rights in order to, champion some kind of biological essential notion of feminine or masculine or man or woman or boy or girl. So it can be really difficult to unpack all these approaches, but what we're unequivocally promoting through the partnership and in the report is human rights, child rights, unlike some of the politicians who have recently come into power who think that somehow human rights are in opposition to equality. No, that is not the case. And so we use the lens of equity, which is like a concept that recognizes the context, the background, the history, that we don't all come from the same starting positions. We're coming from very different starting positions, and we have to kind of like unpack all of these unhelpful comparisons and monolithic groupings. And we have to look at diversity and the complexity of power relations, which Sarah's going to turn to now.
Thanks. So sociology as a discipline is also committed to amplifying the voices of those who are marginalised in society, maybe all young people. So we do focus on research that understands boys' lives through their eyes and in their words as much as possible, in ways that don't stigmatise or make stereotyped or unthinking assumptions about particular social groups. And masculinities and boyhoods are always plural, they're not inherent, fixed or singular. Although one can identify trends in dominant ideals of masculinity, what's called hegemonic masculinity, they also change. They're never truly secure, and they're also contested. They depend on contexts and relationships, ways of doing boys in schools, on the street, at home, with teachers, friends and parents, carers, differ in significant ways down to granular distinctions between different kinds of teacher or friends. Even within one setting like a school, many possibilities of doing boy present themselves in dialogue with the resources and practices of the school community and environment. And this offers optimism about change. The sociological lens is also what's called an intersectional one. And there's complex politics over when masculinity is explicitly named and identified, and in conjunction with what and when it is not. Feminist scholarship over many years has aimed to bring into view the invisible privileging of men and masculinity, where a norm or ideal that is not only male but also very often white, heterosexual, middle class is assumed but unspoken, and anything else is seen as lesser and deficient, and policy and practice is geared towards what men need. Hello, crash test dummies modelled on men ever since the 1950s, still no model in common use that represents a woman. So sometimes we do need to highlight masculinity, but we invariably need to talk about its diversity and to consider which boys are the objects of discussion. We can't avoid the and, it's always boys and. If we're to have a genuinely inclusive conversation, we need to connect to forms of struggle against other oppressions. And a related concept is adultification, particularly of boys racialised as black, whereby they're perceived as adult-like, less innocent and less vulnerable than their white peers, a notion that has deep historical roots in slavery and colonialism, leading services to overlook their needs, disregard their legal rights to be supported and safeguarded and protected, for instance, from being strip searched in schools or stopped and searched by police. And Jessica's going to turn to the key arguments.
Yeah, I'm going to do a whistle stop of some of the amazing amount of research that's reviewed in the report. I do encourage you to read both the short and the long version, especially anyone interested in scholarly stuff will find the longer one particularly interesting. But turning to the key arguments, we do draw on state-of-the-art research and the voices of our rich array of key informants. And we use all of this to sort of, again, trouble naturalized binary and essentialized ideas about boys that position them in opposition to and distinct from girls as binary categories. And we kind of really try and move away from that sort of truism, boys will be boys, which we've been hearing about already this morning. And these naturalized and essentialized fixed conceptions are particularly problematic when we think about violence, and the idea that masculinity and violence against women springs from some kind of innate impulses. We overtly challenge this throughout the report. We draw on analyses of social structures, cultures, and norms that shape behavior, and we try to tackle the issue of violence throughout. So we looked at literature across a range of different sites, families, how families are changing, becoming more diverse, how they can be sources of sustenance, as well as sometimes the place where restrictive norms are being reproduced. We argue against approaches that pathologize non-normative families. We look at issues of inequality, poverty, racism, which have more impact on outcome than any kind of family structure. We look at changing understandings of fatherhood, the need for, caring masculinities. For example, if fatherhood's only equated with financial provision, may make it much harder for boys to growing up in poverty to access a positive future identity as fathers. And we look at the complexity of all of this. We turn to sites. So we look specifically, because this is obviously focused on younger boys. So we looked and we talked to key informants working in nurseries and earlier settings, which can be sites where norms of masculinity are both instilled, encouraging boys not to cry or dance or whatever, but also that they can be positive places. Boys can wear tutus without judgment. Primary schools, they can be places of positive gender learning where norms are both acquired but challenged, provided boys are given the right types of support. Both of us study, I think, more predominantly secondary schools, and perhaps some of our optimism fades, and there's a lot of work to be done in secondary schools. They've historically and continue to be places that regulate gender binaries through their practices and cultures, gender-segregated lessons, uniforms, toilets, sports, PE, gender binaries permeating policies, disciplinary tactics, management, leadership. It goes on and on. So there's a lot of work we need to be doing to unpacking this as an institutional site of very complex power relations. And there's also evidence that the qualities of the ideal student are still much associated with masculinity, being white, upper and middle class white girls assigned supporting roles, working class students deemed deficient, responsibilized for their own failing. So we use our intersectional lens to kind of outline some very worrying trends in school. We look at the high rates of exclusion for minoritized and youth of color, which make us very, very wary of assuming schools can become safer spaces for all without fundamental shifts. These intersecting factors mean we also have to acknowledge young black men are at higher risk in relating to mental health, may experience services as unwelcome, having additional barriers, and we really do try to implement this intersectional approach throughout. And just returning to violence, we do use research that demonstrates girls and LGBTQ students continue to report high rates of sexual and gender-based violence and harassment in school spaces. Very important. We saw the Everyone's Invited movement during pandemic. These issues are coming to the fore, but we have to continue working on them. We look at the masculinity norms that legitimize the violence, homosociality, lad peer cultures, boys performing harmful forms of masculinity for one another, and what are the potentialities of breaking that down? Many students themselves, as we heard, they are the ones breaking these things down. They're the ones finding out all this awesome stuff on TikTok and coming in and challenging the gender binary, challenging all of these harmful stereotypes. So we also look at their own activism and use that as a space to sort of celebrate what's possible, particularly in relation to the digital context, which you were talking about. Lots of positive potential there. Of course, we often associate it with the harmful, negative things that we heard at the beginning, but there's also so much incredible civic, democratic kind of participatory culture going on online. It's a real space for positivity and hope. So I'm going to turn now to Sara to conclude with all of our ways and recommendations forward to round things off. Thank you.
So, there's lots of grounds for optimism. We did have to mention that some existing approaches for working with boys can be problematic if they re-essentialise masculinities and embed limited assumptions about boys. And this is often an undercurrent in discourse about male role models in families and education. It positions women as somehow not up to the job of parenting and teaching boys, men as rescuers, and it often holds up more stereotypical qualities as the ones that boys need. Research tells us that qualities such as empathy are more important than gender for boys and for anyone. Issues such as poverty and racism are more significant to outcomes than family structure alone. Efforts to improve boys' literacy are rarely based in research and quite often reinforce damaging stereotypes about boys as only interested in football and non-fiction books. But viewing gender as socially constructed, as we do, suggests that differences, for instance in school performance, are created by social and cultural practices, shaping how we come to be and act. So any differences observed among the genders are not caused by their gender, but they're open to change in relation to those practices, and so here are the grounds for optimism. So, help boys reflect on what they're seeing, saying, doing. There's so much out there that can help, but again and again our informants mentioned E.J. Reynolds' agenda materials as crucially useful, creative and arts-based methods that open up conversations about positive relationships with young people from 7 to 18, but in open-ended ways that allow it to be on their terms. There's evidence that zero tolerance, boot camp, militarised solutions aren't productive, don't predict the future, engage with boys as they are now rather than as future problems or perpetrators, and don't focus only on changing individuals in ways that shame them. Young people are barometers of our culture, but they alone do not create the weather. They can become accountable. They can tell us their stories and reflect critically on their values. Being sensitive to the intricacies and diversities of masculinities will support critical dialogue between and amongst them, and we can mobilise this to create conversations. It doesn't all have to come from adults, and indeed it may be more powerful from peers, provided the space is safe enough. And the conversation needs to be about factors entangled with but other than gender, especially poverty, inequities, racism. Change the culture, challenge the norms, change underpinning social and structural hierarchies within which we're operating. Start early. Young people notice what we do, and if we don't take action on bullying, sexual and gender-based harassment, etc., it sends a clear message to children that they can't either. But our approaches must always be restorative, inclusive and open-ended. Given the evidence that kids are doing this for themselves, many of us thought that maybe work with adult practitioners is as or even more important than with children, to allow them to reflect, rethink, reconceptualise, take risks and do things differently. Inevitably, this requires long-term investment in youth work, in carers, in creating circles of support around young people. But binary thinking limits all children, not just those on the margin. It's not either or. Inclusive by default frameworks improve settings for the whole community, not just targeted groups. Schools, for instance, developing engaging pedagogies that foreground critical creative thinking in respectful interactive settings, that benefits all groups. Sports such as korfball are more open to a wider range of young people and physical skills, inviting the expression of emotions from the earliest age may lay foundations that enable men to continue talking about their feelings later in life. We need to frame this to be about gender equity, rights and well-being for all children of all genders. We need to frame discussions about healthy masculinities and gender equity, understood within other social injustices, as necessary for all while also acknowledging the specific disadvantage that some groups face. We should avoid suggesting that some boys are deficient or at risk, and instead affirm what all young people have to offer. Above all, we should emphasise the benefits for everyone of changing our approaches. It's not a zero-sum game. Thank you.
Wrong way. Hi. So I'm Karen, I'm Chief Executive and co-founder of Lifting Limits. And now that we've heard about this exciting piece of research, I'm going to talk about Lifting Limits experiences working on the ground in schools. So schools are an incredibly important part of the picture, and understanding how schools are sites of gender socialisation, as talked about in the report, it is critical to understanding the opportunities they offer for social change. So I'll start with just a bit of background to Lifting Limits. We're a charity. Our mission is to challenge gender stereotyping and promote gender equity in and through education. And we do this because gender stereotyping limits children from a young age. The stereotypes are not only limiting of individual aspirations, but also root cause of ongoing gendered inequalities across society. We use a whole school approach. It's based on evidence from a range of fields, and as well as the findings of our own pilot year. And the state of UK boys reports are a really valuable addition to the evidence base. Our aims are to give school staff the gender lens that they need to recognise where stereotyping might persist in the school environment, and then to equip their pupils to challenge stereotypes and inequalities wherever they encounter them in the wider world. And we're aiming for systematic change within schools and across the education system. So having tested a programme in the pilot year, we're now adapting our approach for scaling with a train-the-trainer model of delivery currently being tested in 15 schools across the current school year. And alongside this work, we're the UK implementation partner for the Global Boyhood Initiative. And we were really keen to be involved in the GBI pilot because its aims and methods align very much with our own. And I think Gary touched on the fact that the approach is very centred on discussion, reflection, critical thinking. It's not about giving children right and wrong answers. And also recognising that there will not be a single homogenous way in which children experience gender, but their experiences will vary according to multiple other aspects of their identities and their home backgrounds. And core to our approach is early intervention, because children's attitudes towards gender are quite ingrained by the age of 10. So these conversations need to start really, really early. So that's why we're so excited to develop with Equimundo what I think is the GBI's first foray into primary level education. The UK project differs from other GBI projects by working with children aged 7 to 11 and in mixed sex classes, both because of the age group and also for practical reasons, so that the curriculum could be taught within formal lesson times in schools. And the name of the curriculum in the UK, Me, My Future, Our World, reflects the fact that the curriculum is aimed at children of all genders. So the UK pilot is running in 2 London schools with David Bartlett as the project lead. David led the formative research, which informed the UK curriculum, and over the last few months has led development of the curriculum and training of teachers as facilitators to deliver it in the pilot schools. So the curriculum is now being tested in the pilot schools throughout this term, and feedback so far is really positive. Gary and David and I visited one of the pilot schools yesterday and we heard from staff how engaged the children are in the lessons. We sat in on a Year 6 lesson on emotions and emotional literacy, and it was really encouraging to see for ourselves how much the children had to say on the issues. And interestingly, whilst all children agreed that crying is natural, they nevertheless feel that boys are judged if they cry. And although there was one boy who shared with the class that he'd been told explicitly by his dad and his uncle that boys don't cry, in fact, for the majority, it's a much less explicit message that children pick up from what they see and hear in the world around them. And after completion of the pilot, the curriculum will be made widely available. So these are some of the themes of the curriculum, informed not only by the formative research, but also all the influences that we know children are exposed to in the world around them. And I'm going to take a really brief look at some of the stereotypes which surround children in every aspect of their lives, with a particular focus here on boys. So children are... Ooh, wrong way. Children are, they're bombarded with gender stereotypes. We think about it as the wallpaper, as it's kind of constantly there in the background of their lives. In toys, books, clothing, media, music videos, in the language they hear around them and the assumptions of others, and in what they see modelled as suitable roles in the workplace and at home. And I'm just going to draw out just a couple of images from the slide. The magnetic boys talk words in the top left, sold as a literacy aid, and they say a lot about boys' assumed interests. So mud, dirt, insects, space, exploration, transport, sports, action. The clothing, meanwhile, tells boys to be tough, future boss, a ladies' man, a hero. Gender stereotypes, as has been mentioned, they're by their nature, they're very binary. Defining girls and boys as opposites. So boys learn also at the same time what's not for them if they want to avoid being seen as feminine or girly. So the girls' talk words assume girls' interests as appearance, makeup, friendship, clothes, cooking, dancing. And when it comes to suitable roles, caring roles are overwhelmingly portrayed as for girls and women. And of course, if these stereotypes are not challenged, they become for children just the way the world is. Does all this matter? And I'm not, for this audience, going to spell out why stereotyping matters, but linked to adverse outcomes across a range of areas in school, in the workplace, and health and mental health outcomes, and in public life. And they're harmful for individuals and across society. So having looked at some of the influences on children in other aspects of their lives, just going to hone in on what happens in schools. Schools are not immune from these influences in wider society. And in fact, they frequently reinforce them, which is why this work in schools is so crucial. The report talks about school as an institution that regulates gender and makes manhood. And I'm going to draw out just some of what that looks like in practice in schools. So on this slide are some examples of how we see gender stereotypes reinforced in schools. And this is primary schools. That we work with. And these are some really great schools where staff absolutely believe that they are treating all children equally. But schools don't operate in a vacuum, and given the ubiquity of stereotypes in the wider world, it would be really surprising if it all stayed outside the school gates. So we see gender stereotyping reinforced in the curriculum, in who is taught as inventors, artists, composers, historical figures. You see in the bottom left there, female names in orange. They're not many. It's in the assumptions staff might make when they're looking for children to move chairs or to help tidy up. Assumptions about children's behaviour, that children can see are really unfair, that teachers would assume that boys will be bad and girls will be good. That's what we heard from children in one school. and about what books might interest them. It's in teaching aids and displays around school. So you see a grammar aid here where the girl sings beautifully, the boys kick a football. And the action-packed Second World War stories for boys. And of course, children policing each other. You can't be the nurse because you're a boy. You can't wear that dress because you're a boy, especially in the very youngest stages of education, in the early years foundation stage. Children really policing each other is a big part of the picture. In one of our schools, they did an exercise where they pulled out all the books in a class that had girls in them, and then they removed those where the girls didn't have any lines, and they were left with 3 books. And so really we're trying to help schools to just notice these things. We know that children are aware of society's expectations according to their gender, and this is some of what children aged 7 to 11 tell us when asked what's hard about being a boy or a man. So the limitations they perceive for boys are clear around showing their emotions, expectations of being a breadwinner, what's considered appropriate toys or activities for them, and awareness from some of the unfairness for girls. These are children, these are girls and boys we speak to together. As I mentioned earlier, we've heard similar views from children in GBI pilot school around the judgment boys experience when showing their emotions. The GBI pilot obviously is still a pilot. It's relatively early days, and in terms of impact, so I'm going to look just very briefly at what we do with the Lifting Limits programme to address these issues. And we're hoping to see some of the same outcomes coming from the and some other outcomes as well coming from the pilot, GBI pilot. The Lifting Limits programme it's a whole school programme, starts with staff training, supporting staff with a comprehensive package of resources with over 80 lesson plans, discussion cards, book lists, resources for families, assemblies, role models and more. And it's all about discussion, encouraging children to question stereotypes and really crucially to learn to distinguish them from fact. And there's an example here of one of our discussion card resources. So you see President Obama crying, and the question asks, what does it mean to cry like a girl? And we hear from schools about how they use this sort of resource. So, in some schools, the conversation turns to kind of, biological aspects of tear ducts, and are they different? Or some, it's also a more kind of cultural discussion. But the key thing is that they're having these discussions across their life in school and hopefully taking them outside the school environment as well. And with children learning from birth how gender shapes the world, it's not enough to be non-sexist. These discussions need to be proactive so that stereotyping is proactively challenged with the children. We know this approach works, and this slide just shows some of the impact we see for pupils with enhanced critical thinking, reduced separation between girls and boys, and acceptance of a more diverse range of roles and possibilities. So, for example, over the course of our pilot year, the number of Key Stage 2 boys who envisaged that they could be a teacher, a highly feminised profession, increased by 75%. The number of early years children who saw nursing as a job for everyone rather than primarily for girls at the outset doubled. And we also see real impact for school staff with increased understanding and reflection feeding into changes in practice, and gender equality being embedded across schools, and importantly, a kind of an increase in confidence from staff in talking about the issues with children, with their colleagues, with families in their school community. As I said, for the GBI pilot, it's still early days, but we're really looking forward to seeing the impact that the curriculum can achieve with pupils early next year. And if you'd like to find anything more about our work and about the GBI pilot in the UK, there's a page for the pilot on our website.
Okay, so the final speaker is Ben. Here you are. And Ben and I have worked together over a number of years in different contexts. And again, you know, when he's actually in and amongst boys and young men, he not only serves as his own role model and uses humour a lot, actually, and kind of just empathy to demonstrate, you know, walking the talk, being the person that they could emulate. So, Ben, your work, please.
Stop. More. I'm joking. I'm going to set a timer so that I don't go forever, because I have no self-restraint, which is not a good thing. This report, this is super useful, right? I'm not a person who particularly enjoys reading books, so this was like a really succinct way of understanding what the state of play is. And I think that this conversation is really, really important, right? The biggest question that we get asked as an organisation, so that's a good place to start, sorry. My name's Ben, nice to meet you. I work for an organisation called Beyond Equality, and Beyond Equality is a gender equality organisation that works to engage men and boys in the gender equality movement. And we do that primarily through the lens of masculinities. So we work in schools, in universities, and in corporates. And I guess the schools element of what we do is the most relevant bit here. So our schools program talks about relationships, healthy relationships, sex, sexuality, emotional literacy, mental health, violence against women and girls, gender-based violence, all of those kinds of conversations. But the biggest question that we get asked as an organisation is usually from mums at events. I get pulled to the side afterwards and they're like, how do I talk to my son about this kind of stuff? Or from teachers, members of staff in schools who are also trying to have these conversations but find it a little bit confusing or a little bit troublesome trying to broach the conversations with the boys. So the question is, how do we do that in a way that's successful? And for us, I think it starts with thinking about who it is that we're talking to, who's in the room, right? When we're talking to boys, generally, there are 5 different types of kids that I run into in workshops. So number 1, is the boys who don't care. They're not interested, they don't want to be there, they don't want to listen to what you're saying, they're not bothered, and it's not because it's coming from a bad place, they just don't think that this topic is relevant to them. It's not something that is important in their lives, so they don't want to have that conversation. Number 2 is the skeptics, and these are the kids that are accessing, I know we've had a bit of talk about Andrew Tate today, accessing loads of far-right media online, seeing loads of these conversations, getting hold of these kinds of ideas and kind of just mimicking them. I don't think they're thinking critically, they're just repeating things that they've seen online. Loads of stuff on TikTok, loads of stuff on Instagram. And I always say when I go into these workshops, my job here is not to convince you to change your mind, right? We're not going to be able to do that in a 2-hour session, but it's just to get you to engage in a conversation. So whether you like it or not, even if you are oppositional the whole time, that's fine. Just chat with us. Number 3 is boys who feel like they are being attacked, which is a very real feeling. I don't know if it's a real thing, but it's a real feeling. They definitely feel it. And so holding space for that in a workshop or in any kind of session, any kind of conversation is really, really important. I think one of the things we do culturally is kind of dismiss that and tell boys that they're wrong for feeling that way. But it is a reality, it's something that they feel in real time, so we have to speak to that. Number 4 is boys who are confused. So they get that there's a problem, they just don't really understand it. They haven't had loads of conversations about it, they haven't wrapped their heads around it. So we try to hold space for them to have those conversations. And number 5 is boys who want to help. Laura spoke earlier about those 3 boys that walked up to her at the end of the workshop and were like, we want to start a feminist society, how do we do it? Are we allowed to? And I think there's, I wouldn't say a large subsection, but like definitely a subsection that exists of boys who want to be engaged in these conversations, who know, whether it's because of relationships with women in their lives, in their families, or whether it's just some kind of internal moral compass that makes them a good person, I don't know. But they want to help, they want to do something, and we've got to give them ways to be involved in these conversations. Now, my theory of change, this is not like a research thing, this is just what I apply in my mind when I walk into sessions, is that we can't move people 4 steps. So you can't move somebody who's never had this conversation before all the way to helping out. They've got to take gradual steps in this conversation. So we're not trying to move them from point A to point E. We're trying to move them 1 step in the conversation. So to consider things that they haven't considered before. And how do you get them to do that is a big question, right? This is a picture of me when I was a kid. I don't know if you picked that up. But the reason that this is up here is because I think one of the most important things we can do in these conversations is locate ourselves in what we're doing. One of the things I come across a lot from people who work in this sector, who work in this field, is a lack of empathy for the boys that we're working with. We want to talk to them and tell them who they're supposed to be. And actually, that replicates one of the most harmful elements of masculinity as it stands, which is the prescriptiveness of it, right? So we're not trying to tell them a new way of being. We're not trying to give them a new set of guidelines and rules to follow. But what we're trying to do is understand them, understand where they're coming from, understand who they are, what their experiences are. And I think the conversation that we've had already about intersectionality is so important, because also there's this idea that all boys are the same, right? Which is just not a reality. And so for me as a young kid of colour, this conversation might have been slightly different to the conversation that some of my peers would have been having, but it's important that we take time as people who are having these conversations, whether it's with our family members, with our community, with our friends, with kids in schools or institutions, to understand their perspectives and where they're coming from. So, developmental stages of 11 to 13-year-olds. So this would be our Key Stage 3 program. And I think that this is really important because there are some things that we have to consider which make this conversation quite a unique conversation for kids of this age. So things that they're going through and experiencing, is it going to do anything? No, okay, cool. Number 1, puberty is a really, really big thing, right? I don't know who here remembers going through puberty, but it wasn't that great, man. It wasn't a good time. But there's loads of stuff going on, whether it's hormones, emotions that are out of control, or just physical growth, right? There are things happening to your body that you don't know, you don't understand. People are trying to teach you about it, but it's also different for every child. So all of those experiences that are happening really impact the ways that boys can engage in these conversations. Peer pressure. For kids that are 11, 12, 13, they've gone into completely new environments often. So they've gone into secondary school, they're now gone from being the big boys on campus to being the little babies in a pool full of big fish. That's not a good analogy, but little fishes in a pool full of big fish. And the peer pressure that they experience, the expectations of masculinity and the way that that is policed, particularly in secondary school institutions, is pretty aggressive. And so that is a pressure that they're feeling, and they don't want to lose. They don't want to be made to look different or weak or vulnerable. So they try to keep up these appearances, which is an important part of this conversation. Personality, around this age, kids are distancing themselves from their parents, and they're trying to establish a new way of thinking and a new identity. And they're veering towards their friendship group, so trying to think for themselves, have their own ideas, and this is where a lot of the controversial stuff comes from. So when we run workshops, kids are just they're testing boundaries from the very beginning. They want to see how far they can push you and what they can get away with, and that's fine, and it's normal for their age group. Empathy here is at the end, because this is something that comes in the next developmental stage. So they haven't started developing empathy, which is often why they say loads of stuff that's pretty fucked up. Sorry, am I allowed to say? They say lots of stuff that's pretty rough. But that is coming, and I think being aware of the fact that that's something that's developing in them is something that's really important in having those conversations. Often we try to reach for their heartstrings and pull them and argue that this is the right thing to do and they need to understand what it's like for other people and put themselves in other people's shoes, but they haven't actually started that process yet for themselves. So being aware of that is really important. Sexuality is changing. Cognitive development is also really, really interesting. So obviously they're getting smart at 11, 12 and 13. They're starting to think for themselves. And they are not taught in schools how to think critically, but they are starting to exercise critical thinking. So they want to test what you're saying. They want to test theories and ideas. They want to counter-argue and have debates. Telling them the right answers isn't going to work. You have to have a conversation with them. Long-term impact, so they are starting to understand that their actions have long-term consequences, which can be a really useful way of having these conversations. So rather than the moral argument, the argument about what is the impact of this in the future, what might happen if we carry on down this path, can be a really good pathway to take them down. And they're big into risk-taking behaviour at this age. So they're doing things that they wouldn't normally do, things particularly that they're told that they're not allowed to do, they really, really want to do. And that's not to say that that's fine for them to do it, but it is important in having these conversations to think about what we're telling them is right and wrong, because they will rebel against it. They're going to try and do the opposite of whatever it is you tell them. So all of those things are really, really important to consider when we're having conversations with kids at this age. So, how should we approach boys? 4 steps here that I think work really, really well. Number 1 is with curiosity. Being genuinely interested. Is this really weird? Is it me? Can you all hear that? Okay. All right. Should I go here? Is that better? Yeah. No? Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's my time. Thanks, everyone. I'll go quick. Okay, so with curiosity, super, super important that we're genuinely taking an interest in where these young people are coming from, in what their experiences are. Often we project an image of what we expect of them onto them, and kids are smart, right? They can feel that in the room and they can understand it, and they make a decision about whether they're going to rebel against it or they're going to play up to it, and if they play up to it, it doesn't end well for you. So be curious, allow them the freedom and the agency to be an individual in the room, allow them to have conversations and have their own perspectives and celebrate them for them, even when you don't agree with them. Number 2, with empathy, that says number 1. I'm really bad at PowerPoints, everyone. I'm so bad at them. With empathy, super, super important. So I spoke about this a little bit before. But the empathy piece is absolutely crucial. There is no point in having this conversation unless you're doing it from a perspective where you can understand where the kids are coming from. And for some of these boys, they've been socialized as boys and they've been told that they're boys, but they might not actually feel that way. Understanding where they're coming from is so, so, so fundamental to this work. If you're not doing it, I would say don't do it at all. If you're not going to empathize with them. And it can be hard because boys say horrible things, right? Like when they're 11, 12, 13, they say things that are really triggering, that are really jarring, things that are quite violent, things that are quite aggressive. But I think a good path to take with that is to not take any of that stuff personally, and to empathize with them. Try to understand where it is that they're coming from in what they're saying. Number 3 and number 1, with exploration. Exploration is super important. So often we have this pathway in our minds of how a conversation should go. And I'm not very good at active listening. It's something I have to practice really, really hard. I tend to listen for the first half of what I gauge someone's saying and then start thinking about how I'm going to respond to win an argument. But actually, genuine exploration is really, really valuable, because what we find with boys is that if you give them enough space and enough time, generally they will arrive at good conclusions by themselves. They're not stupid, right? And if we can think something, chances are they're going to be able to arrive at that same conclusion. So allowing them the space to explore is really, really important. And the last one is with fun. Don't make it boring. Do whatever you can do to make it an enjoyable experience for them as young people. Particularly in education institutions, they're so used to being sat down and told what the right answers are, told what they have to think, and having to memorize those answers to pass exams. Anything you can do to take them out of that format is a good thing to do. So engaging in fun activities, fun conversations is really, really important. So one of the examples of an activity that we run in schools is called a word race. So we do a version of a word association game, but it's also a relay race. And we give the boys topics and some pens, and they run to a whiteboard and write down any words that they can think of that they associate with the topics. So the first topic we do is men. Words that they come up with are things like strong, dominant, powerful, penis. And this is an edited version, right? We've taken out, it's usually just penis, penis, penis in loads of different words, and then some other things, but we've made the other things more relevant. Athletic, money, and I think what's interesting about this is that not all of these things are inherently bad, right? Loads of these things are things that we want to encourage the girls in our lives to experience or to embody. So the problem here is not necessarily with the specific characteristics, but with the power dynamics that are underneath those characteristics and the expectations that boys have to embody these things. So what we're trying to do is give them license to choose and to give them freedom to express themselves however they feel that they want to do that. When we ask the same question about girls,
So this is the question, what is a man or what's boy?
this is for men.
Man.
Yeah.
What's a man?
Any words that you associate with men. Yeah. And then we do any words that you associate with women. And it's feminine, caring, pretty, kind, mother, kitchen, and again, loads of words for vagina. Also, Porno Hub is on here, which I find really weird because that means that more than one child wrote Porno Hub. And it's not called that, but it's fine. So these are the kinds of words that I just find that odd. These are the kinds of words that they come up with for women. But this is the aim of this activity, right, is to surface the idea of gender stereotypes. And this is a good example of practicing what we are talking about here. So the temptation is when kids write things like this on the board to tell them off and to tell them not to do it again. So that we stamp out that behavior. But actually, there's so much space for learning in here. There's so much space for exploration. So many of these things are so interesting. Asking where they get these ideas from. Did they see them in TV? Did they see them in films? Did they hear them in music? Did they learn them from their parents? Did they learn them from their friends? Where do these things come from? And why do we believe that they're true? All of those questions are really, really important questions for us to ask. The same with the gender stereotypes around women. Not necessarily telling them off, and the time does come, right, where you do have to have some harsh words, but I think there's also space to have genuine exploration of these ideas, to ask what the impact of some of these things are on women, what the impact of some of these things are on men. What does it mean if you're a man and you don't feel like you have access to kindness? If you don't feel like you have access to kitchens, you don't learn how to cook, it's basic life skill, right? So how do we teach boys to think critically about these things without telling them what the answers are? I'm sure you're all familiar with Tony Porter's idea of the man box. So this expectation of what men are supposed to be in our society. So things like not crying, not expressing emotion, not expressing weakness or fear, demonstrating power and control, being a protector, being a provider, so on and so forth. And these ideas are really, really interesting, but what we find is after that last activity, we can get the boys to create this by themselves without telling them what it is. So if we ask them what all of their expectations are around what it means to be a man, or what do people expect you to be when you grow up, they'll come up with a list that is almost identical to this. Which then leaves us in a really strong position to kind of reimagine what that can be if they want to be the best versions of themselves. If they want to be healthy, they want to be happy, they want to have good relationships, they want to have good friendships. We can go back to that idea of long-term consequences. What does this look like in the long term if you're doing all of these things, and how does that play out for you as an individual?
What is a man for you?
So no, we ask them any words. We don't do too much explaining. So we'll just go, we'll say, we're going to play a word association game. Generally at the start of workshops, I don't even tell them what they're talking about. I don't give them a preface of what this is. I'm just we're going to play some games, do some activities. First one is word association. We might do breakfast as a practice round, and then we'll do men, and then we'll do women. Are you stealing my ideas? No, I'm joking. They're free. Everyone can have them. Yeah. So, reasons why this is important, right? It's a men's issue. And I think that this is the crux of this conversation, is that actually, when men are playing into these ideas of what masculinity is, the outcomes for them, or when boys are playing into those ideas, the outcomes for them as men are really, really detrimental. They're really harmful to men. So 76% of suicides are carried out by men in the UK. 86% of violent crimes are committed by men. Boys are 36% less likely to access higher education. And men in the UK have a life expectancy of 79, which is 3 years less than women who have a life expectancy of 82. What we're not saying is that we want women to die earlier. That's not what the conversation is about. But I think when you give boys, after doing some exploration with them, you can start to give them facts and statistics and ask them to make the links themselves. What is it about the way that we practice being men that might lead to these outcomes? And they're smart, like I said, they'll get there by themselves. So without telling them that because you don't talk about how you're feeling, that means that you're likely to commit suicide or complete suicide or attempt suicide, allowing them to do the exploration. We ask them questions like, is it weak for a man to cry? Would you be embarrassed to cry at school? Is punching a wall a good way of dealing with anger? And once they've processed all of those conversations, they can start to make the links for themselves between these outcomes and those expectations. So, how to engage boys, last 2 slides here. Number 1, don't treat them like they're the enemy. Super important. I think often when we're having these conversations, we want to correct boys, and boys feel that and they don't respond well to it. So treating them like this is a conversation about them, because it is a conversation about them. It's a conversation for them. It's not just a conversation about being the hero and saving the women. This is also a conversation about the outcomes for them as young men. Number 1, help them to see that this is about them too. Number 2, obviously. Help them to see that this is about them too. So how do we have this conversation and make it about them? And number 3, equip them to make changes. So not just overwhelming them with the scope of the conversation and gender-based violence and violence against women and girls and all of those kinds of things, but also how can you make steps in your lives and in your communities to change these outcomes for other people around you? And things that boys can do. So number 1, learn to call out other boys in their communities when they're seeing harmful behaviours, when they're hearing things that are not funny, or even things that they think are funny, but they can see the long-term impact of those things is going to be negative. To call those things out and challenge them, which requires them to be brave, requires them to be strong, it requires them to have some guts, but those are things that they can do. Those are things that boys often aspire to be and aspire to do. So utilising that, rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, how do we turn those things into things that are beneficial rather than harmful? Number 2, listen to women, to girls, and to non-binary people. Open your ears for boys, right? Like, I think that this is a big part of the conversation. One of the reasons that our organisation works with men and takes men into schools to talk to boys is because teenage boys don't listen to women. They've not been socialised to value women's opinions, apart from maybe their mothers, but often that's not the case. So even when we have female members of staff walk into classrooms, we see a massive change in the ways that the boys operate and the ways that they have conversations, the things that they say. They self-censor a lot. They don't want to get in trouble. They won't necessarily tell the truth. So important that they learn how to listen to other people's perspectives. The conversation or the work that Laura has done is so important with the Everyday Sexism Project, because it has given space for people to share their experiences in a way that other people can digest and internalize and listen to. So that's really, really important. And number 3, choose what masculinity is for themselves. Boys have a real opportunity here to redefine what masculinity means for them. So rather than playing into or living up to this set of expectations that is placed on them by society, maybe by their friends, maybe by their parents, maybe by the institutions that they're in, they have an opportunity to redefine, to look at all of the characteristics that are available and choose which ones will help them to be the person they want to be and to live the healthiest life that they can live and the happiest life that they can live. So all of these conversations, super, super important. And I think the best thing you can do is just start having conversations. Even if you get them wrong, you will get them wrong, that's fine, don't worry about it. But I think having that conversation is absolutely fundamental. So that is the end. You're welcome.
Okay, so we're going to invite everybody up on the stage who presented this morning. Just do come up, everybody. But we're really going to take questions from you. And I just wanted to mention something that almost at the parallel time to this report being launched, I've been involved in another report, which is the Day School Trust, who have released a report called the Girls' Futures. And like number 1 that the girls talk about in the schools is that they need survival skills. Survival skills. And you imagine like for an 11-year-old to say that's what they want, they have to have survival skills. But I think that everything that everybody's saying is that the boys also feel they need survival skills. So much of what's happening for girls and boys in schools is surviving. And, you know, we'll survive by whatever means is handy. And that often means like reinstating stuff, which even we might not actually agree with, but we have to sort of do it. And it was very relevant as well. The people who kept coming saying, what should I do on mums and not dads? So, you know, there's such a lot of work to do. But again, it's really like if we really, really care and love boys for whatever they will turn into, then we can't keep demonising them at all. Any more than we should marginalise girls. So the lack of potential that we keep kind of throwing at people by suggesting that they, you know, that we should diminish them in some way, I think that's a really key to even those of us who think we are on the right side. Because I think you've all suggested really, that people can go and be very prescriptive and quite punitive, puritanical. You know, do we actually like boys? You know, what are little boys made of? You know, puppy dogs' tails and
Worms and
worms.
all kinds of
I mean,
disgusting
exactly.
things.
Long before I was ever discussing gender, at 4, I remember learning that. You know, that boys were basically smelly, and girls were nice. You know, that's like a really, really critical kind of idea that we've put into nursery rhymes. Okay, so questions from the floor, thoughts from the floor, and there's also some online questions as well that have come in. Anybody got something that they want to raise? Okay, thank you. Do you want to just introduce yourself as well so we know who's in the room?
Hi, I'm Sara from Movember. Thanks so much, everybody. This has been such an interesting event. And I guess I wanted to ask a really difficult question that you may not, or there may be multiple answers for. But when we talk about some of the kind of issues around masculinities at Movember, I often say that the problem is thousands of years of patriarchy. Kind of that's what we're up against. But obviously, when we're thinking about boys and boys of the particular age ranges that we've talked about today, I'm sure there are much more specific, tangible influences on their lives that feel like they're the biggest barriers to change. And I was just interested in the views of the panel around, from the work that you've done, how you would pinpoint some of those barriers to change.
Okay, so there's the kind of long story of patriarchy as an embedded structure, and then there's like the things that they bump into and what those are that need to change. I'm going to take a few more questions and then we'll wrap them all up. Anybody else? Yes? Lady in red? Could men be ready to put up their hands as well, please? Yeah.
My name's Mary Sharp and I'm the CEO of the Reward Foundation Love, Sex and the Internet. And I haven't heard much, although I loved everything that I heard today, I didn't hear much about the impact of pornography. Because whatever you do in the classroom, however good the talks are, kids are using their phones at any spare moment they have. So I just want to say that we've done work on this. We've got free lesson plans for schools, so nobody can say they don't have the funds to pay for it. But it's to make them critical about pornography. But because it undermines, it produces a sense of extreme male behaviour and extreme female behaviour that is very confusing for young people. Thank you.
Confusing for everyone, actually.
For everybody.
Anybody else?
I can project.
It's for the streaming.
Oh, sorry. Hi, thank you everyone. I'm Jane from Plan International UK and I work with our youth panel, who are predominantly girls. And I was just wondering about themes of happiness in the work that you're doing, just out of a personal curiosity point. I don't think we talk about happiness for young people enough.
Mm-hmm. Very good point about inner joy. Okay, let's just take those three. Gary, I'm going to start with you actually. You know, the kind of the obstacles that people are bumping into on a regular basis that need to be addressed. Pornography, you can go there as well.
Yeah, thanks.
And happiness.
Sarah, thanks for starting with the big one. How do we overcome patriarchy in a 1.5 hour session? One I think is to, and I think the study aims to do this, which is to cast an X-ray and say, look how much we rebuild harmful ideas of masculinities every day. Our survey work finds that 60 to 80% of boys experience physical violence from other boys. And when we ask the why, it's mostly being policed to be a certain kind, to not look gay, to not look effeminate, to not do girly things, to not show emotions in inappropriate ways. So we invest a huge amount of energy. I would flip the question around and say, isn't it amazing that we've actually had a feminist movement? Isn't it amazing that we've chipped away at it the way that we have? Because we invest a huge amount. If I look at my home country of the US, look at what we do to make a militarized version of masculinity every single day. And then beside to that, look what we do to make the producer, consumer, go to work and produce, I work, therefore I am version of manhood. So, you know, in some ways, it's amazing that we have boys breaking out of the box, because we spend a lot of energy making this. For individual boys and men, I think the biggest issue is fear. We are afraid to get called out. If you ask me my single most prevalent view of my high school, my secondary school years, was fear of other guys. Of what day, which one would pick on you that day, what you would do wrong, how you'd be ridiculed. In my case, it was also who had a gun, because that was real in Texas and still is. So yeah, fear and just how much we remake these ideas every single day. I think when boys can step into it, I think Ben said this really thoughtfully, there's this sense of relief and happiness that, and that ties to the happiness question. I think when guys can step into a space that I don't have to live that, I think there is a happiness, the question that you brought up. Yeah, thank you, Mary, for bringing up the question of porn. Your data is inspiring us to look at, you know, what is the average age at first looking at it, about 11, how little, and I think this connects to what Ben said, how little we are prepared cognitively as 11-year-olds to make sense of what we're seeing there, right, and how that is shaping how we look at our own bodies and the bodies of others. And I think that is the squeamish, is that a word? Squeamiest. That's the conversation that parents don't want to have. We've talked, you know, said, how do we include that as a topic? And parents were like, don't talk to me about that, don't make me talk about it. The don't ask, don't tell. I don't want to know my sons are looking at this, let alone our daughters. So I think there's a huge amount to do there. And I think what I worry about there, and that brings back to the happiness, is how much we're taking pleasure out of what should be, out of intimacy in what we see there. So to be talked about more. That was, sorry, I went on too long there.
Not at all. I was going to say, I mean, what's your response to those questions? I mean, one of the things I feel as well is that adult men don't know how to find a way into openness. There's, you know, shame covers a lot of subjects over. And so being able to, as a man, explore what do I feel and what will I discuss about pornography? Where does happiness come from? And, you know, what are the kind of micro things I do that don't make change happen because I feel too embarrassed to change them? I mean, how much do you think adult behavior is still, you know, drilling down onto 11-year-old boys and kind of going, that's what I need to be?
Yeah, difficult question. But what is interesting is when you see adult men testimonying about themselves and how they behave, and especially in a group of violent men who are talking about themselves, and when they realize that that in fact the origin of their behavior is coming from childhood and the education that they have received and about the relation with their peers. When they start to understand this, it's really trigger in them something that make them realize the structure of patriarchy and how the ramification of patriarchy is really building our society. And so I think that as adults, it's important to really realize how these stereotypes are really present in all our institutions and are really orienting the way children are building their identities.
Yeah. Excuse me, I mean, we had 3 questions from women and I've gone straight to the men on purpose really, because I know that if it was the reverse and we were talking about women, you know, if all the questions had come from men and then men really basically answered them as well, I think that you know, one of the big loops that we're trying to kind of go around here is how do we get men to express love of men? How do we get men to express care and involvement with boys? Why is it mothers asking the questions? Why is it feminists, if you like, you know, asking the questions? I'm going to come back to the women in a minute, but you know, like I have had people who work in prisons. Most of the prison population are men. Most of the prison visitors are women. Most of the teachers of men are women. And we have got to kind of get to the bottom of why men find it difficult to love men. You know, yes, fear men, yes, guard against men, yes, protect yourself against men, but you know, that's a kind of a huge issue. So, I mean, the issue of happiness, Ben, you know, when you put up those things like skeptics through to allies, if you like, I thought, well, that's any age, isn't it? I mean, it happens to be boys, but it's any age. But you must go from, you know, since you do always go in with empathy, what's the point at which you can see happiness in the boys that you work with?
Oh, I was waiting for the mic, but I've got one. That's fine, thank you. What is the point at which I can see happiness? Well, do you know what? Almost, for some boys, almost immediately. I think, like in our introductions, I'll ask I'll ask them when was the last time they had circle time, for example. And they're like, oh, year 2, we don't do that. And then we do a version of circle time where we ask them their name, one word that describes their name, their pronouns, one word that describes how they're feeling today or like their internal weather. And if they could have any superpower, what superpower would they have? And intros are meant to take like 15 minutes, but mine take like 45 because I really care about what they're saying and I'm really interested in superheroes. So we have like pretty robust conversations, but in that, I think even just in that space of like, them knowing that somebody's going to listen to them, you see a lot of freedom of expression, and you see those dynamics of fear play out really early, where some kids try and police the behaviours of other kids. But I think as the authority figure in the room, you have the power to destabilise that. So you can be like, oh, actually, we're not doing that, or no, I do find that really interesting, to the kid that always gets bullied for saying what they think, or whatever it might be. So I think there's lots of happiness, but there's also lots of angst. And I think boys tend to, on the spectrum, only really experience or only be able to articulate happiness and anger. And that's the two extremes. There's nothing in between for them. So I think giving them the language to like explore all of those middle bits is really, really important.
So, Karen, how does that reflect the work that you're doing in schools? You know, that idea of going in with empathy, with fun, with uncritical acceptance, even though some of the stuff that you're hearing back is kind of intolerable on a certain level, but as a way of moving consciousness raising forward.
Well, I mean, it's a lot about the staff being equipped to do that with their class, and they're the ones who know their classes. So in our model, it's the teachers who know the children really well, and about just letting them have space to have those conversations. And what was really interesting in the school we went to yesterday was that the teachers were telling us afterwards that actually it was often that some of the children who participate most in the GBI lessons are children who participate less in other classes because they're just, you know, they've got something to say about it, and it feels kind of important to them and relevant to them. So that was really encouraging. On the happiness, I just touching on the happiness question, I think the word that comes to me, I think, from this kind of work with the age group we're talking about is maybe relief more than anything. It's just that kind of being told it doesn't have to be done that way. That you can be yourself in a different way is maybe just a kind of like it's maybe the first step on the road to happiness, but it's that kind of just just because you're a boy doesn't mean you have to like these things. It's just hearing somebody or being given permission to go that way.
And Sarah and Jessica, you talked about the way that sociology sort of tries to move away from the individual problematizing through to actually saying, no, here are ways that society kind of almost manufactures behaviours, and you can deconstruct it again over time. When you have sort of mass movements like the pornography industry,
well, the drugs industry is another one, but the industries, the games industries, that take the norms and then like strengthen them. How do you, in sociology terms, like suggest methods of deconstructing that?
I don't have my mic, so I don't know if I could have that one. Because I want to talk about porn. Give me a mic. You know, the thing is that we do a lot of on-the-ground research with young people. You're in the classroom working with them on a daily basis, but it's actually quite difficult to do research on porn with children because a lot of parents and, well, I'm not how to speak about them nicely, concerned people get very, very worked up that somehow, you know, we are exposing them to harms or so on as researchers, and actually we're trying to understand what their everyday experience is. So it's very important that we have these conversations. Young people are very critical about porn. You know, and you open up a conversation with them about it, they want to know. They're like, why is this happening? And what would you do about that? And what age should I be doing this? And they need to be having these conversations. So, you know, and we need to be doing research on this. I can't say that strongly enough. And we can't be stopped by people who are like, oh my God, you know, the researchers are grooming children or whatever. That's actually not what's happening. We're trying to understand what's happening on the ground. So, and when you do talk to young people, you find they're super critical, they're really engaged, they already know everything, so you just sort of have to have a discussion with them and really take their views and approaches seriously. And we didn't have scope for talking to young people for this report, but we tried to talk with all the experts that are working with young people on a daily basis. So when it comes to porn, I think young people have a criticality, and we just have to keep working with them and upskill them and help them as much as we can as adults. So Sarah, I think you have a mic already.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose I totally agree with everything that Jessica has said, and I think it's important for us, well, I suppose in response to the question about patriarchy, I think yes, as a feminist, I kind of totally agree that, you know, our society is saturated with patriarchal norms, and, you know, there are histories in everyday actions that we take. On the other hand, young people are not born within an awareness of patriarchy. They're born into the world they know is the world we create for them. And I do think that their survival skill is to observe very closely, you know, who and what they need to be to get through in the world. And so there is scope for us to change what that can be and what those stories are that they're able to tell about themselves. But I think we need to carry through some of the insights that you've talked about in terms of recognising young people's criticality and awareness, and not to create new normativities in a way. And actually I would say that, I suppose that's my concern about happiness, is that if we demand that people are happy, that could be potentially another demand that we make of them and a norm that we impose on them. And actually, I'm afraid, I think that can also be said about some discussions about pornography that refer to it as a monolith, as though pornography is only one thing and only has one meaning and doesn't have any diversity, doesn't recognise young people's critical ability to negotiate contemporary culture in all its forms, and also doesn't necessarily think from the margins, to think about the fact that pornography means different things for different people. Yeah. And for a young gay boy, porn could actually be a lifesaver. So we can't sort of make assumptions, and we can't iterate what we think pornography or sex should be. We have to take our lead from young people and be more nuanced and diverse.
Okay, now are there some questions online that you want to raise? Yes. Because we're streaming this live.
Yeah.
Yep.
We've got quite a lot of people on the live stream, but we have...
And we've got 10 minutes.
Yeah, we have only a few very active members. So we've got Mark Brooks, who's the Policy and Communication Advisor on Male Wellbeing from the Mankind Initiative. He first of all wants to say that, Ben, you were excellent on the point about the lack of empathy, and we should not be telling them about how to be. The contradiction is much of this report's framing of is exactly doing that. That's a comment he wanted to make. But his first question is, what research and conversations have you had with the charities actually working on the ground with the boys in the UK? And then, shall I ask a few questions? Or?
Yes, just, yeah.
Yeah. So we've got Sonia Shaljian, who asks, what consideration have you given to the impact of fatherlessness on boys and its potential contribution to the issues you are addressing? And then we have a lot of comments. We have one warning from Joel Shaljean, who says, much of the discussion here and the muted future work in schools around gender equality, in brackets, not equity by the way, treads a very narrow line between educating boys and vilifying boys. Please be careful.
Okay, well, I mean, I think the warning is something that everybody is trying to address, actually, which is that you can't start off by saying, well, we're cross with you, we don't like you very much, and we wish you were something like this instead. You know, that is just never going to be a beginning. But I don't think that is how you come up with the work at all. But the question, first of all, which is, you know, who did you partner with in kind of UK charities? It was quite a long list already, but do you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, first we had an inspiring example, the partnership with Lifting Limits, because you've started this journey of how do we talk about gender in schools, and then the long list of experts that you consulted on the work, and Beyond Equality, which has also been a pioneer in how do you have these conversations, I think, as we saw. I think there are others. There are certainly groups that work on LGBTI plus issues. There are other groups that work on that I'm not the one from the UK, so I would look to our two researchers and our NGO partners who work on this. But we know with taking this intersectional lens, there's a lot of partners to include. This is only some of them. So I think to consider this a start, not that it's done.
Yeah. And what about the question of, you know, the impact of fatherlessness? That's a very, and that's not even like not having a father in a household, is it? It can actually be a kind of sense of father's absence. I know when I was doing the Being a Man festivals, the most significant thing that men ever talked about was their relationship with their father. It was like the constant thing, the go-to moment for who they were was how they got on with their father, or more likely didn't get on with their father. And so fatherlessness isn't really just an absence, is it? It's a more complicated thing than that. Anybody on the kind of research side, have you done any work around that in particular, or are you aware of any work around that?
Well, the fatherlessness. I mean, I think we say quite clearly that we want to avoid sort of stigmatising and pathologising certain absences. Right. I mean, you know, it sounds, as from what you said, the question could be, what consideration have you given to fathers? You know, like the presence of fathers are also sometimes problematic, but we need to work through these things and not make assumptions, and certainly not assume that therefore households that are headed by women are in some way deficient or problematic. You know, inevitably, we want to interrupt any of those inevitabilities, and I think that's also what we said all the way through the report in terms of trying to intervene to not vilify or stigmatise boys, particular groups of boys.
Can I just comment on the fatherlessness one? You know, I think we, again, and the paper does a good job of this, let's talk about the root causes, the structures that lead to it. I mean, the conversation about fatherlessness, particularly if we think about it in low-income households and households of color, is to look at the effects of poverty and racism. So if men are separated involuntarily from households, it is a legacy of those two things. And I think we too often, again, individualize this. In US English, we often speak of the deadbeat dad instead of what it really is, which is a dead broke father often, or a caregiver who can't be there because of all the structures that say if you're not financially providing, you don't get to be present. We don't have welfare systems that support usually unattached fathers or men in general. So I think to look at the structure of it and to say, what is the psychological absence that I think you're touching at, Jude, which is how have we made manhood so that men aren't nurturers that we should be, or the caring individuals that we want to be. And so I think we flip that around, Sarah, and I agree with you absolutely, but let's look at the many ways that men are present in caring and nurturing that we don't value every day. So yeah, there's a lot to dissect in that, to rethink how do we make caring versions of masculinities, and that's what I would hope at the end of, of this work on boyhood is what would we see boys aspiring to at the very least, to be caring, connected, loving humans, some of whom will become fathers.
Yeah, I really, really agree with what both of you have said, and I think that comes back to the question that you were asking initially, right, about where do we tackle patriarchy in this work? And I think you can't use the language of patriarchy and all of the isms and MSCs and all of those kinds of things with kids, because they don't necessarily know. It's a lot of work to just explain what those things are, but they say if you can't explain a thing to a child, then you don't really understand it. So I would say having those conversations in ways that are accessible to kids has to be the core of this conversation, because you might be able to convince a 12-year-old that they shouldn't choke their partner during sex, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they understand why, and it doesn't mean that they understand the root of what that thing is. And I think we spend so much time battling symptoms and fighting fires rather than like going to the core of what the thing is and giving them the skills to analyze what is making them behave in these ways. And I think even with that conversation about fatherlessness, it's again rooted in the idea that fathers are a specific thing and they play a specific roles, which is just a bunch of gender stereotypes that we place on people. So I think one way of dealing with it is to say, I do think, again, curiosity and empathy. What is the experience of living in a household where your father is not present, whether physically or emotionally? How does that impact you is an important conversation, but also like the other conversation around what is the expectation that we have of fathers? And what role do we expect them to play, and how does that impact you, and how does that hurt you or harm you in what ways, I think is an equally important conversation. So I would say, that conversation is super, super important, as are all of the conversations. The conversation about porn. I used to teach sex ed before this job, and when I got here, I think, again, locating yourself in this work, all of the pieces fit together for me once I understood patriarchy. And that was the thing that made me think, oh, everything's linked and it all works together to make me a certain way and make other people a certain way. So I think those conversations, we have a whole module on it, but it is, they are really, really important on one hand, but on the other hand, we can't get lost trying to solve the little individual things rather than tackling the thing that is the cause of all of those things. So I think that's an important prioritization to make in any work that you do with boys.
When people are being taught screenwriting, there's a very, very famous screenwriting course, and they dissect Casablanca, like frame by frame, as a way of demonstrating how you create, the structure of a perfect movie, regardless of whether you think Casablanca is a perfect movie. But if you wanted to have a look at like a perfectly beautiful construction of patriarchy, you might want to watch The Lion King, frame by frame. You know, it is the most seductive and marvelous piece. You will be crying and drawn into it, etc. And watching it with, children makes you think, oh my God. Everything about it persuades you that the order of the world is patriarchal, and that's got very strong father images as well. And it's really interesting what reinforcing is happening, not just like now, but things that when you put on the old video of Button Moon or whatever, out it all comes still. Right, we have room just maybe for one or two more questions. I think we should, the live people maybe?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Helen Griffin and I'm from Gender Action, which is a whole school approach to gender equity for all ages in the UK. And what I've been thinking, we're all, all of this work is excellent, and we're working at grassroots as well, working in schools. And I'm just thinking about policy level and how with all, this force that we are, potentially, how do we actually influence Department for Education policy, Ofsted, etc., to make, it easier actually, the doors open more easily into schools to get this work embedded.
Okay, we'll take that. Any other questions from the floor?
Thank you. Great question, by the way. EJ Reynolds, Cardiff University, work in the context of Wales, so actually sometimes different contexts, conducive enough to kind of move things forward. But I've got a question about, we've talked all about not making assumptions. So I'd love to hear a bit more about what does that look like. I've heard a lot about how that might work in practice, but what do we need to do to facilitate at every level, within peer groups, within people who may be delivering these kinds of things, and also a little bit more about, well, what does critical and creative pedagogy look like? What conversations now do we need to have that move from our recommendations and put those into practice? So I'd love to hear much more about the practices and the possibilities of doing this work in different ways, whether it's through word association or different kinds of ways to engage this that maybe don't just sit inside a classroom and think wider in terms of whole school and community-based approaches.
Okay, and is there anything more online? One more?
Yes, I just...
You pass it that way.
I should have got my sister roller skates.
Yeah, we've got just a sort of similar question actually from Mark Brooks again from the Mankind Initiative. And he asked, what calls are you making on government to deal with boys' educational underachievement?
Okay.
Sexually abused boys are called by the government as victims of violence against girls. Will you ask government to change this?
Yes. Is the answer.
Do you want me to go first?
No, it's just so you, when you, if you
Oh, see
that. Questions are too hard.
Okay, all right, well, and listen, this will be the end of the questions. Then we'll go downstairs. There's food and drink and networking and socialising and questions, informally. But yeah, let's just start with the kind of pedagogy into practical programmes, which aren't just into schools. Because presumably, an awful lot of what you want to do as researchers is make something happen in real life, as it were, not just in academic contexts.
Oh my God.
You don't have to solve everything today.
Yeah, I don't know how much to say on a live stream, but we do have a pretty hopeless government.
I don't think that's not going to come as a revelation even to people online.
Which government, though?
The statements that have come out just in the last couple of weeks around human rights and around being opposed to equality, calls for age-appropriate RSE, which we know is a code to kind of like do less, and it's a difficult situation. Like, how do we press for change in the policy and educational levels? I think that we had a strong recommendation about investment, and that's what we're seeing here today with this partnership and collaboration, is like we're all coming together, trying to tackle these things really outside the parameters of, the official government response. So I don't have any answer to that one, but I think we just need to keep struggling for equity and human rights and inclusion, which is what is the strong message of our report and the sort of message of caring and connected boyhood, which is the main overarching message.
Yeah.
So maybe we can go around the whole circle.
Yeah, so on the policy front, I think it's that there's such strong evidence from such a range of areas, as you know, Helen, about the benefits of doing this work from an early age for children's well-being, for mental health outcomes, domestic violence outcomes, girls in science, and just kind of we need. It needs to be the case for early intervention maybe needs to be a bit more joined up and kind of movement building, really, to just get it out there. And I think policymakers often take a much more kind of short term, they're looking for something that's going to impact, violence against women and girls statistics like, today or next year, and something that's going to take much longer, working from an early age. Is kind of a harder sell, but really important to keep making those links.
Sarah, anything?
Well, I don't know if I'm an expert on policy interventions, and that's why it's good to be part of this, and it's good to hear that there's so many people in the room who are perhaps also thinking about these things, and these are conversations that we can have. I'm painfully aware that so many of the conversations are a kind of like, well, I wouldn't start from here. If we want to talk about, even just within schools and changing pedagogy, we need to have a different kind of curriculum that is more open and less content focused and less driven by kind of just getting through stuff, and that has been dominant in England. It's not necessarily the same in other countries of the UK, perhaps. So there's always diversity to draw on and lessons that we can look to from other places. And I think some of those things that have been really squeezed is not only the early interventions but the long-term youth work that has been about having a long-term presence in young people's lives, and that has been squeezed out for targeted interventions. And there's some evidence that we're now beginning to appreciate what's been lost through that. So those are some of the approaches that I hope perhaps will come back.
Yeah, I mean, certainly informal spaces, constructed, held, but informal spaces for young people where quality conversations can happen are much harder to achieve now because there's no kind of youth service to speak of. Any of the thoughts that you want to bring?
On policy, I think that at national level it's really challenging for political reason and for financial reason because of budget restriction. But at international level, you can see that there are growing commitments in terms of prevention, and the issue of engaging boys and men is slightly growing, and so this is something that governments will at some point need to integrate in their policy. And I think that having this type of pilot that we have with lifting limit is contributing to provide evidence on what works, and also to propose practical tools that can be easily used by governments. So I think that the process will definitely be long, but at least there is a global commitment, and giving this practical solution is.
So you think there's actually a global commitment?
It's something that is growing, that was not existing, and that is growing. For the last Generation Equality Forum with the United Nations and governments which were part of it, there was a commitment taken to develop prevention programs at school level for children. So there is this, the topic is on the table.
I keep, against all odds, still believe in rational-based policy making, but I think we have to acknowledge the moment we're in, right? We're just so much as crisis and response, and how fear is being taken over by the far right, and not even the far right, the middle right, to implement some of the most regressive policies we've seen in many countries around the world. This issue is getting attention, but often as a boyhood equals crisis conversation. And I think it's too easily used to then push back against feminism. So I think if there's a moment that we can seize as a group is to say, all right, pay attention if you think it's a crisis. Let us get in there with messaging about what we need to do this right, to make sure that it's a feminist message. It's not about decentering what we've been doing for girls and women. It is to say this is part of it, this goes together with it. So I'm trying to find that sliver of optimism in moments where we're seeing lots of not rational-based policy making, and where it does feel like the kind of evidence-based approaches that we're using and using research to start the conversation feel kind of helpless, but we're still going to keep at it. And thank you to our two lead researchers on this, that to say that this is where we start. So yeah, I'm trying to end on an optimistic note on that, but it's challenging in these moments, to say the least. Yeah.
Could you repeat the two questions here?
Well, one was really about, well, the three questions, but one was about education. I mean, how embedded is this work in like formal education and governmental initiatives? The second really was about how does this sort of research and even like policy suggestion turn into practical ways of doing stuff? And then the third person was on the online, wasn't it? And it was again really about education and like whether the state, I'll put it that way, is going to commit to this journey, or whether it has to continue being basically ad hoc, random, in the zeitgeist of the society, as opposed to the frameworks of the society.
Tough questions, man. I'm not a policy person, so I don't really know, to be honest. But I do feel like I'm not putting much hope in policy change in a way that is positively going to. So I do believe that the work is going to remain grassroots, like groundwork, like people on the ground doing stuff. And I think maybe the thing that we can focus on that will be useful is data collection. I think that having a decade's worth of strong data that evidences the positive impact of this work will leave us in a more positive position when governments do change and when there is more of a space to have the conversation. So I think that's one thing that we probably don't do very well as a sector that we can probably do a little bit better. And I would say, in terms of education, I think my personal opinion, this is not my organisational opinion, but my personal opinion is that maybe we focus on the wrong things and we try and, like, we reinvent the wheel quite often. We create new content and then new content, and this is the new workshop that we're doing, and this is now the 3 questions that we ask boys, and this is rather than like investing in the spaces that matter. And I think those are teachers. And I think that starts with paying teachers more and making teaching a more appealing career, and then training them better to be able to have these conversations and to embody the experiences. I think there was a really important point that maybe you made about changing the structure of schooling and the problems around the structures of schooling and hierarchy and gendered norms. And I think all of those things, until we change that stuff, like all of the work that we're doing gets instantly undone the moment they walk out of the room anyway, because they're going back into an environment where they're being told to tuck their shirts in. And I think, like, not that uniform is inherently evil, but I do think there are some ways in terms of being, like things like shouting at kids being normal, until we challenge that, like, boys are not going to understand that that is not an appropriate way to communicate with other people, because that's how they're communicated with. So I think, yeah, an investment in education, an investment in schools and teachers and training is probably a good direction to go in. But I just run the workshops, bro, so I don't know, I might be chatting nonsense, do you know what I mean? But that's my feeling on it.
Okay, well, look, we started really to say we're celebrating the launch of this report. And this is progress, and the conversations are happening across the world. I mean, I do WOWs all over the world. I've just come back from the Seychelles, which sounds like a really good gig, doesn't it? Yes, but I mean, there's 100,000 people live in the Seychelles Islands. 10% of them are hard drugs users. They call themselves a matriarchy, because I say, well, what does that mean? They say, well, the fathers kind of come and go. There's, you know, there are kind of lots of conversations happening all over the world. If we do WOW in Pakistan, which we have for the last 7 years, 45% of the audience are men. Not because they're policing the space, but because they really, really yearn for a different kind of outcome now for their girls and for their partners. So there are some really interesting desires that are happening for a world that is not the one we've got yet. And I look at the climate change activists, the young people in climate change activists, and they have an incredible knowledge and language. They've had their consciousness raised, they've raised each other's consciousness, they've come forward and they're demanding change. And if we could get that same sense of confidence in girls and boys about gender and the impact of gender on so many other decisions, you know, financial decisions, military decisions, etc., it would really, that would be what changes things. So we still have to give them the sense that they are the ones that have the agency and they are the ones that matter and that we care and that we really care. So it's all work in progress, isn't it? But we're not going to go out here feeling despondent, because what we were actually talking about this morning is a group of people who've taken action. And you're all here because you feel the same way. So why don't we go downstairs and have some tea and coffee and croissants and some fruit and carry on solving the world.